Hey, welcome back to the What the Tech podcast. I'm your host, Troy Vermillion, and we've got a good one for you today. As many of us in the tech world are navigating the new normal from a remote or hybrid work standpoint, there are often competing forces between work-life balance and productivity, as well as output and company profit margins. Now, today on the podcast, we're actually going to discuss some of the different hacks we can employ to get as much work done while maintaining a healthy work-life balance. One thing I've learned over the years is not always about getting more hours out of your day, but rather optimizing your time for maximum output. So let's dive right in. All right, my next guest is at the helm of HR at Datapath. It's a tech company specializing in cloud-based cybersecurity solutions, really built for the mid-market and public sectors. And with over 15 years of experience actually working as a writer with a love for telling stories, one might say he's actually an expert in the world of communication as well. So, in fact, he has many of his former colleagues would say that he is an amazing writer, and he actually holds an MA in psychological science from Cal State University as well. And he's also an accomplished martial artist, which he didn't tell that to me, but I actually found that information out on the internet, as we all can, and actually has a vast level of experience, both as a CEO and founder of his own company, which actually has led him to additional successful roles in operation and human resources. So it's my great pleasure to have Dan O'Brien joining me on this week's episode of What the Tech. Dan, welcome to the show, my man.
Man, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Really excited about it. Been thinking about it all week. Loved the intro. You encapsulated me so well. Maybe you're a better writer than I am, because that felt a lot more succinct.
Well, I mean, It's always fun getting to know people through the eyes of other people, because I'll actually go through and I'll read like the recommendations that you have on LinkedIn, or if you have other things that are out there. And I just find your background so unique. When I first reached out to you and I said, hey, I think you'd be a fun person to have on my podcast, it was because you had like a unique background in digital marketing, and you're now working in the HR space, which I love digital marketing and what it does and how you can use it. And I've been in the HR space, and I know how dry HR can be at times. And so I was like, how do you mesh those two things really well?
Sure.
And I'm interested in hearing more about that. Before that, I want to do a quick icebreaker with you if you're cool with it.
Excellent. Let's do it.
Absolutely. So my goal here is to feed the listeners with really practical things that they can use. And a lot of that has to do with experiences that we all have, and things that we live by, and certainly adversity that we go through. So I shared this with you that I had created an acronym in and around the word eat, because, hey, it's food for our listeners, so we're going to eat together, right? And so the first one of these is, I'd love if you wouldn't mind sharing an embarrassing moment that you learned something from.
You know, the one that really sticks out to me was really early on in my career. So, obviously I've done a million different things at this point, and, I might look a little young, or maybe I look old. I can't tell anymore. But I've been in the game a little while. So one of the first meetings I ever had with an actual company on my own as a consultant, I made a huge mistake, and then I compounded that mistake. So the huge mistake was I assumed that they had the same information I did. So we shared a document that was supposed to sort of have, what we were going through was the proposal.
Right.
I'd sent the wrong proposal. And so we're going through it. I could see the look on their face going, what is going on? What is this guy talking about? And I'm just, carrying on, pretending like I know what's going on. And I get to the end, and I have any questions? And they're like, yeah, what are you talking about? And I the worst feeling of my entire life, because this was pre-Zoom, right? That dates me a little bit. This was like an in-person meeting. I'd handed it out, didn't look at it, like I had somebody else print it out. It was one of the most embarrassing things I did, and it taught me a really basic principle, which is never assume anything about an interaction, right? Ask a question you don't know, ask first, right? And that extends whether you're a CEO or an entry-level employee. And then 2, check your work. Like, make sure that you put in front of people the best possible version of what you're trying to you get them to talk about before you actually engage in that interaction and conversation. Beyond embarrassing. It was one of the single most embarrassing moments of my entire life. Worse than standing in front of a crowd and not knowing what I'm talking about, because I was supposed to be the professional in the room, and nothing makes you look more professional than not being prepared for that.
I'm curious about that situation. Did they give you another chance, or did it go up in flames?
They did. I do pretty well in front of folks. I don't know how well it goes over on camera, but I'm pretty authentic, pretty nice dude, and I apologize. I was so embarrassed. I owned it immediately. I was like, "Wow, you guys are not the only proposal I have out there. I work with a lot of people. I made a huge mistake, but I do really want your business, and I'd love the opportunity to do it again." And they did. Like, they did immediately. It wasn't like I walked right back in the room. We rescheduled, and it was a slightly smaller thing, and we had a good laugh about it. It worked out okay in the end, but in the moment, it was pretty big disaster.
Yeah. So you learned a lot from that. Fair statement.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's
for
good.
Sure.
That's good. I think we've all had situations like that. I can think of a lot of embarrassing things that I've done in my sales career. So thanks for sharing that one. Let's talk about potentially an adversity that you've encountered that you feel has made you a better person, or respectively better at your role.
Sure. No, that's a fair one, because there's a moment that sort of sticks out to me. There was sort of this switch in my mind from who I wanted to be and who I was, and so I would take jobs with the intent of being the best possible I could be at that job, and then inevitably I would hit a ceiling, or the business would hit the ceiling, and I'd think, what did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? And constantly, kind of hitting my head on that, I realized that I needed to think about what really mattered to me. And right, so there was this constant uphill sledding of, well, I went to school for psychology, so I have to do something in the psychology field. I love writing, but I don't have a background in English literature or something. So if I want to write books, I have to do blank. If I want to publish, the traditional channels might be kind of closed off. So it was sort of rethinking how I can approach my goals, and then kind of working backwards with smaller and smaller goals. And so adversity is one of those things that I feel like affect people differently. And so I'm pretty fortunate, I think, and I'm pretty grateful for that I haven't had real adversity in life, in the sense that like it something institutionally kept me down. But there's been plenty of times where I felt like, boy, I can't get past this next thing, especially early on in my career. That was mostly just mental blocks. It was like, well, I was thinking about it wrong, or I was approaching it with a mindset of what was missing versus how I could solve it. So not being solution oriented relative to it.
Right.
But now I and as corny as it is, I just see problems as possible solutions. I see adversity as an opportunity to learn something, and maybe design a solution for somebody else potentially. And so it doesn't really hit the same way. But a lot of those early losses, I think, and those early bumps and bruises sort of paved the way for feeling that way.
I like that. It's good. And, I think we all face some adversity, but it sounds to me like that earth-shattering one hasn't come yet. And fortunately, those things can make or break
Fingers
a lot
crossed.
of people.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. So, well, good. So what is a truth that you live by?
It's not all about me. And
Okay.
that's probably kind of a goofy one. And I have a daughter now; she's 2, and that, of course, that's not adversity, but that changed my world perspective, right? So, however you feel before you have, children, you feel very differently after, right? But even before that, it's really easy, or I found it was really easy when observing others and even my own behavior, that I can make it about me, right? So every situation was like, oh, how's this? I don't like this. How does this make me feel? And kind of recentering to, well, it might not be about me. A conversation about something important, once it extends to other people, it's more about them now, because these people are sharing a moment, and whatever I felt coming into it isn't about me anymore. And when you extend that to work, and when you extend that to entrepreneurship and everything else, I've said this before, and I think we said this kind of in some of our conversations. CEOs work for employees, and employees work for clients and customers. And part of that is it not being about you. If every interaction is about you, it's easy to go on the defense. It's easy to see every employee complaint or manager complaint at you as like, this is all about me, and solutions sort of become impossible to find. And I found that if I make it not about me and just look at it as, well, there's a problem and there's a solution, because there's nothing that can't be overcome. How do I do that? And taking myself out of the equation is something that's really helped me move past that. That's something that I live by in every interaction, no matter how stressful. It's like, well, it's not about me. Like, this one isn't really about me. So,
I wonder. I think it does work, because introspectively, if we're looking at how many things in our lives that we make about us and how unproductive that is, right? To like accomplishing goals, removing impediments, or whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish,
Sure.
business or professional, or even personally, right? How many missed opportunities are there because we're making it about us?
And even the flip side, right? You know, when someone's mad at you, it's, and this is on the personal level, right? So this is the psych and therapy background. It very rarely has anything to do with you. It almost always has something to do with, you know, a conflict they're going through, adversity they're facing, and not knowing how to manage it. The best thing you can do in that moment is, you know, well, how can I help, right?
Yeah.
Not, oh, I don't like what you're saying to me. This is so horrible. It's, you know, what can I do to help make things easier so we can, you know, find a way through together. So, yeah, I do believe that's my one thing, I would say.
I think it's a good one. I think it's a good one, and it's something I could probably add to my list as well.
Good. That's good. That's
Yeah.
good. I like that.
There you go. I'll take it. So how do you take a background in, you know, storytelling? I'm just going to call it storytelling because you had a long list
like
of
that.
things that you've been writing for a long time in a variety of capacities. But like, how do you take that and how do you use that today in your role as the leader of HR at your organization?
So I had this catchphrase when I was doing only content consulting, which was storytelling is life telling, right? So the notion is every piece of storytelling, whether it's fiction or it's narrative fiction or it's nonfiction, is picking a perspective and then moving through life, right? Whether it's a fictionalized life or it's actual life that we all sort of share. And so in an HR role, right, because that's kind of HR tech is kind of what, you know, the focus of this, the biggest thing I can think of is that person, their entire world, they're the hero of their story, right? Every employee is the hero, you know, or the villain, I guess, if they think poorly of themselves, you know, of their story. And every CEO is the same way, right? So looking at it from that perspective, you realize that people are just making choices, and only the choices that feel available to them. So it's a choose your own adventure in real life in the business sector. So I that didn't happen overnight. Like I didn't go from like, oh, I like to write, you know, about vampires to this is how it correlates to, you know, working through HR interactions or dealing with operational issues or managing a company. But when I started to look at it as it's just a series of choices that have consequences, and when looked at in a larger context, you can understand it better. In the same way that you want to look at a story in its context, right? That whether you like a show like Breaking Bad, which is about someone sort of going from like nice school teacher to, spoiler alerts, a bad guy, right? It wasn't one choice. It was a series of choices where there felt like there were less and less good choices. And so when you apply that same kind of principle to managing employees or working on building culture at a company, you can see the same parallels, right? And so and digital marketing was the easier one because honestly, content marketing is just storytelling. Like the best content marketers, I have a buddy, Devin Belly, I'm going to give him a shout out because I'm going to share this and I want him to hear it. Biggest HubSpot fanboy, started Black and Inbound at HubSpot. Incredible guy. The dude knows storytelling and he's not even a writer. He gets it because it's a marketing thing, right? He gets that the best part of marketing is seeing yourself in the story of the brand or the company or the infrastructure, right? So from an HR perspective, can you help an employee see their character in the story of the company, right? Because everybody knows who the CEO's story is, right? They're Tony Stark. They're the top of the whatever it is, whatever silly metaphor you want to use from a movie. But every person has a role, and every person sees themselves as a character in that story. So it does sort of blend into everything, and it really for me at least. I mean, I'm not sure it's as simple for someone else to see it that way, but it feels true to me to see business and human interaction that way. That it's a story. We all have our own stories, and we have shared stories, and we have separate stories, and all of the stories have a narrative, right? And finding out that narrative is the perspective that you want when making business decisions, right? Or making human decisions, which I think in the end, we talked about this, you know, offline, but the idea that all business decisions are really human decisions because it's two human beings interacting, right? So you can't truly take that element out of it.
Yeah, it's hard to remove the two.
It is.
And I think innately we are all attracted to stories, and I think that HR, you know, is really the cross point for so many different needs within an organization. that, and there's so much change happening right now with the way things are going. We talked about, diving into, what are some of the key drivers for productivity within an organization, and how do you do it in our current work environment, which is different than what we experience. Even within tech, it's different than it was some years ago, right? And so being able to tell a good story about why maybe you're making a change, or why this makes sense for the organization and for the characters in the story makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah, it does, yeah.
So,
like that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say there is something to be said about when looking, because you kind of touched on the productivity thing, right? And so innately I want to jump over there. But there's something to be said about the story that you tell. It can't be a fiction, right? It has to be the truth of the situation.
Real life.
If you're selling employees on a fiction about what's happening, and I'm sure you've experienced this and people listening experience this as well. You say one thing and it goes the other direction. Boy, nobody's gonna like that story, right? You got a mob of pitchforks versus a group of people that want to go share a common goal or overcome a common obstacle.
Yeah, no, I think in business, everybody likes a feel-good story, but they don't necessarily want a fiction story about what's happening behind the scenes, when they probably have either a gut feeling that that's not really what's happening or going on, or that they're just feeling out of the loop, which, that's why transparency and communication has become so imperative within organizations, because for so long, employees have been, left out in the dark. What we're seeing right now with the fallout in tech, the amount of layoffs that we've seen and other things, a lot of employees were, and look, there's an ebb and flow to these things, right? But a lot of employees are impacted negatively when those things happen. And so, if you're telling stories, and I've experienced this, where it's everything's fine, okay, we're laying off everybody, right? And that's not okay, right? And so being transparent and honest with people is super, super important. And and it's not that you're telling a story that always has a good ending, because those happen too. But how do you spin that in such a way that and spin may not even be the right word, but how do you put it in such a way where they get it? They understand.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And then I get that, because the context matters, right? So the idea of telling a good story isn't about telling a story that's a happy ending.
Right.
Right. It's about telling a story that's true. Yeah. Right. I mean, oftentimes, if it's something dramatic, and I would argue that any business situation where layoffs are possible, that's a dramatic situation, right? Yeah. And there is the only outcome of that is someone is going to be affected. Right. And so, you can make the argument that businesses could do more to cut costs at different levels to keep people. But if the reality is people need to get laid off, managing that conversation, I would say, versus maybe spinning it, is about being authentic. It's about being honest with it, right? So I've been a part of companies where layoffs, happened. And the reality is I didn't pretend it wasn't going to happen. I didn't pretend that it wasn't there. Yeah. I didn't lead with, man, we were a big family and we loved you guys, and, we wanted to keep you, but we couldn't. It's this is the reality of it. But for me, because it's a human interaction, it's how can I help on the other end, right? So it's not just throwing somebody out in the dark. It's, well, what do you love to do, and how can I help you get to the next thing, right? So, if you love tech, is there a pathway to freelance work or consulting work or another company, or, provided they were employees that we would have wanted to keep for some reason, but couldn't for budgetary purposes or for larger operational issues. I want them to land softly, right? Because we're all in it together, even if we don't think we are, because of how connected everything is. So if you do a mass layoff and you're not very nice to people, the world is too connected for people to not see that. That company will have difficulty recruiting in the future, right? They will have difficulty getting and retaining talent in the future, for the simple fact that they didn't want to take the time to have a really hard conversation, right? So for me, managing that conversation is just being honest all along the way, including that really, really tough conversation. And I don't think it's unfair to say some people just don't want to have those conversations, but that's why you have HR, and that's why you have people who are in people operations to manage those for you. And then hopefully you're hiring people that care enough about people to want to have hard conversations, because that's how you get through it, right? Because if you... My brother has this fun saying of saying you can't re-gruntle people once they're disgruntled, right? So if you lie about something, right, if you tell some fiction in the beginning, and
Right.
then the ending is very different, you can't change that first story you told.
Right.
And that sits with an employee whether they stay or they go, perhaps the rest of their life. I mean, I know folks that I've worked with in other organizations that had a bad experience, and
Yep.
that influences every decision going forward, right? They're sort of carrying that experience with them into new roles, and they kind of treat managers or look for triggers or look for things that were similar, and they're kind of setting themselves up to be unhappy. And it's not that an employer has a responsibility to make sure the next role is good for the employee, but I think as a human, we have a responsibility to do what we can to help other humans. So I guess there's kind of a humanist approach to it, which I suppose is kind of, silly and altruistic. But it matters to me. It's why I shifted away from operations and leadership roles that were only focused on business operations, because sometimes that came at the very real cost of human interaction, like really understanding why people were there to begin with, what mattered to them, and making sure that the company was leaning into that, was actually making sure they were taking care of people on a level that they needed. And that matters, right? And that matters most because in those moments when it's hard, that's what employees will remember. They'll remember, like, okay, well, they're not just saying nice things. They did care about us all along the way, and this is hard. And, maybe don't go on LinkedIn and make a video about how sad you are they had to lay people off. Like, I'm just saying, like, that's probably not a great way to go about it, you know what I mean? Like, have that conversation with your employees and make sure they hear it, make sure they don't hear it somewhere else. Don't write open letters, make sure, or if you do, make sure you've already had the conversations with the people leaving and you're sort of helping them soft land somewhere.
Yeah. Well, let's stick with the theme of storytelling and consider, some of the things, I guess, in your background that you have some expertise and experience with, in and around kind of key productivity, indicators in your organization today, other organizations that you've worked for, and how do you marry those with kind of just the current state of business, potentially moving into a recession? What does that mean? As well as, remote work and hybrid work, and, what does it look like to both, get the productivity you need, but also not to steal people's time for the sake of stealing their time.
Yeah, there's this really interesting shift, I think, that's been happening for at least 10 years, maybe more, but the move to remote work because of the pandemic, and then just a large push generally has moved forward, is what productivity means, right? So I think there's an old idea that's left over from manufacturing and left over from factories generally, which is, there's a 40-hour work week, and you got to fill it as much as possible with active work. And we've sort of moved into a place where employees know their worth enough that if they lean into organizations where that's the main focus, they're going to jump ship and just look for money, right? And so the biggest thing I hear from CEOs and stuff is, well, how do I keep employees if all they want is more and more and more and more money? Like, how do I incentivize them to living there? And really, a lot of it to me is about giving employees options, right? So there's really simple things you can do, like have sort of a flexible schedule, right? So not just like you can show up whenever you want to, but start later in the day, go later in the day, split up your day how you want to. Because we're remote, there's you can't move the 40 hours from 9 to 5 in person to 9 to 5 online and be like, okay, that's remote work now. Remote work has a very different benefit, and that benefit is allowing employees to have the space to do a lot of deep focused work that you don't get in an office. In an office, you get a lot of that interpersonal communication that you do lose in a remote setting, right? You don't get water cooler talk. You don't get the ability to be like, oh, hey, Troy, how's it going? I heard this, that, and the other. And maybe kind of have that impromptu meeting of the minds that maybe drives a sale forward or drives some initiative forward. But what we have instead is people really learning more about who they are and knowing what they want. So you can get better employees. You can get happier employees. You can get employees that understand why they want to be at your company and why they want to stay. So they have better answers in reviews when you say, hey, what do you want to see out of the next quarter or the next year? Or how can we help improve your career path? Or what do you want to see? It isn't just, oh, I just need more money. Because I'm just, getting in my car, driving to a job, finishing the job, coming home, and then just clocking in and clocking out and clocking in and clocking out. Remote work offers, businesses the opportunity to really advance how the employees want to be a part of their company by giving them the space to examine it in a given day. And I think a lot of companies are too focused on, well, do we have 80% productivity? Or do we know that I'm sure you've seen the articles out there too. Like, your remote employees probably aren't working as much. They're just sitting around on the couch in their pajamas or whatever it is. And if they are, so what? Like, are the outcomes met? Now, if the outcomes aren't met, if this goes back to more of an HR thing, in the sense that, well, are your roles properly defined? Do they know what's expected of them? And if they know what's expected of them and they're meeting and exceeding those benchmarks, then the problem with what they do with their time relative to those business outcomes is more about that top-down perspective, right? That's that part of the story. So what does leadership look like? Well, leadership used to look like yelling down, maybe, right? And that wasn't a great way to do it. And if we really want to advance remote work to become something where you're keeping employees, you need to give them the space to grow. You can't migrate the in-person stuff to the remote stuff and think it's equivalent, because of course it's not, right? It's not just the distractions, but it's the ability to have more moments within a given day to do stuff. So for instance, I've always done like the 50-10 rule for working, right? So if I work an hour, I work 50 minutes of it, and 10 minutes of it is sort of focused work or quiet time within the work itself. So that way I'm not just trying to like plow through 6 hours of work, regardless of what it is, because every single study in the world and even personal experience will tell you, you don't get a lot done. You're the least efficient when you do that, right? You get tired, you get mentally exhausted. So breaking that up allows you to do it. And teaching employees to do that, if they don't already know how to do it, is great. But giving them the space to have the opportunity to do that, I think, is the most important thing.
Yeah, and I think that one of the challenges that we often see with that is that, we still have some traditional kind of ways that we do things, and in a remote environment, it is a little bit more lax. So, like, talk about maybe some ways that you guys have encouraged both the creativity and some of the things around what people want from their work and the way that they do work, in comparison to maybe what we've traditionally kind of known and expected from people, because there's such a huge amount of value in that. Because one of the examples you put or you mentioned was, in most cases, the only thing we knew to ask for traditionally was more money for the same, same job or whatever. And that's not always the motivation. And so organizations, by investing, in the right things and, gathering feedback from their employees, actually may fundamentally, by giving them more of their time to do the things that they're more passionate about, or to break up their day or whatever, could potentially, see themselves not just having to throw money at the problem. It could be, that they want something else from their work. And now that they don't have a commute, they don't need as nice of a car. They don't need to spend money on gas or these other things. And so, some of that money is recovered that way. And so what are maybe some of the things that you're doing or suggest that people consider?
So, I mean, there's no one size fits all. I mean, if there was, I would start a consulting business tomorrow and just sell that, right? But the reality is, it starts with that conversation. You kind of mentioned it's that information gathering part of it. I think the simplest thing a company can do is not skip past that because they think it's a waste of time. So if your first instinct is, yeah, I know employees need to have quarterly conversations about how they're doing, but we just don't have the time. Right. That's why they're asking for more money, right? Because they are seeing their value as represented only as the amount of time you can keep them. So making the space and the time to have the conversations and ask questions about what people actually want. To your point, if you don't have a commute, maybe you don't need a car. That doesn't translate to them necessarily not needing more money, but maybe their internet bill went up, right? And so they don't necessarily need X amount of a raise. They would just really love it if they didn't have to worry about their internet bill. Or maybe they just had, they welcomed a new child into their life. Maybe you could help with diapers, right? Or maybe you could help with mental health resources to give them the space to occasionally be able to step away, right? So a lot of it comes down to, and this might sound like an obvious concept, knowing your employees, right? So on a very basic level, taking the time to be like, what matters to you? Like every person needs to make money in a world where money is the primary trading currency that we have, right? That part of it, if that's still the only question you're asking, then you're not going to get very much out of your employees, and you're certainly not going to be able to retain it, right? So you need that first step, regardless of what these smaller initiatives are to keep people, is to actually ask, and not like passively ask, and not ask once and never ask again, right? It's ask and ask again. There's a term that someone used in a meeting somewhere, to be professionally annoying about it, right? Ask people early and often what matters to them, and then follow up on it, right? So if someone, like for instance, something goofy I did, and it sounds dumb, is I started a bunch of football pools and basketball pools and baseball pools, and it was a really simple thing. And what people won wasn't money; it was a personalized jersey for their team that they love.
Dude,
And they thought
that's
that was
cool.
the coolest thing that's ever happened.
Yeah.
And it costs the same. It costs the same amount of money or less than you would if you just like gave an Amazon gift card or you gave them a bonus day off or whatever it is. But you know what matters? Like I know I got a guy in an organization who loves the Yankees. Boy, I'm gonna take time out of my day to be like, man, do you see what Aaron Judge just signed for? Holy cow, you guys kept him, right? All of that sort of matters, right? And it stems from, did you have a conversation with your employees? Were you professionally annoying enough about it to follow up on it and make sure they really understood? And then do you do that with new employees, right? So culture isn't something that's built in a day, but it can be destroyed in one moment, right? So you need to make sure you're doing it with the folks that you have and the folks that are coming in, and that there's a consistency to it. And it isn't just a story you're telling, right? To go back to bring it full circle back to the story idea. If you're just telling a story about cultural values and what matters in your company, but you don't live and breathe it in every interaction, it's a lie. It's not something that's actually translating. And so the ability to keep folks, there's not a panacea, right? There's not one solution. But I would argue that there is a way and a path forward, which is ask often, and follow up. And if your human resources staff or your people operations folks are doing that, you're on a path to having happier employees. And to me, the most productive and efficient employees are employees that have a passion for what they're doing, they have an understanding of where they're going, and they feel heard and valued in their organization. And that might sound like, well, that's everywhere, right? It's not, right? If it was, you wouldn't see job hopping. You wouldn't see large dissatisfaction scores generally, regardless of whether it's in person or remote. And you wouldn't have these sort of gold standard companies where it's like, oh, no, the culture, like HubSpot, right? Everybody wants to go work at HubSpot because the culture at HubSpot is fantastic. Like everybody wants to get a job there for a very good reason. Because the culture is so great, but not all companies are doing that, right? But they're doing something right, and they are their own human resources marketing because they're carrying that through, and that's the simplest way to do it, is have the hard conversation, because it's only hard really once, because then you get it out of the way, and it's like, okay, now I know what matters, and I was wrong about what I think mattered, and now you've told me, so now let's focus on what actually matters to you. And again, back to the one thing, it's not about me, right? So as a leader, at some point you're like, man, it's not about me, it's not about my ego, it's about this thing I wanted to do. If I actually want to accomplish it, everybody needs to be rowing in the same direction. How do I actually accomplish that?
So I'm curious. So what are some ways that you're leveraging communication tools or strategies to do that? And then, how are you, I guess, tracking and measuring those things moving forward? Like, what are some good ways for you to do that?
I mean, an ESAT score is always an easy one, right? So just asking that, ideally on a weekly basis, because that's that professionally annoying thing. So you're getting kind of like, at least 3 questions, right? And they could just be a 1 to 10, like, how are you doing, right? How well did this week go? And then, can anything be improved? How can we help? How can we get better as an organization? And so that's going to give you that sort of ongoing baseline of what it is. I've seen people use different tools, like stuff that integrates with Slack, stuff that integrates into their HRIS. I've seen people use forms. I've people use Google Forms to do that. There's certainly a lot of ways to accomplish that. The tech itself, though, it's about keeping it simple for the user. And of course, this applies to almost any tech product, right? If it's not user-friendly, you're not going to get adoption, and you're not actually going to get any data, right? So whatever the tech is you decide to use to collect information, sort of keep that ongoing baseline of satisfaction, make sure it's simple and the cadence makes sense and people know when it's there, and again, that you're professionally annoying about making sure that you're getting some level of adoption so you have that baseline. The other part of it, I would argue, is the review process, right? So everybody wants to know how well they're doing at all times, ensuring that you're actually taking the time to use the either the native systems or the systems that your company uses to communicate with, to have those reviews, and that they're simple, right? They're almost self-guided for both the supervisor and for the employee themselves. I'm a big proponent of letting employees provide a self-evaluation, and then the manager providing their evaluation, so there's sort of a comparative aspect to it. But don't only do one or the other, right? If your review process is, hey, employee, fill out this survey, That's not a review, right? That you're asking
Right.
somebody to take a test. That's not very useful. So I wouldn't say there's, the tools are more about ease of use for your employees. Like if it's something they're already using, find a way to utilize where they're at. Like I'm a big proponent of go to where people are. So, if someone is getting their information over here, maybe that's just the marketer in me, go to where they are. Don't try to spend time and money and resources to get them to go somewhere else that you're fighting not just tradition, but you're fighting their choices already because they're already over there. So go where they are with something that they value.
Yeah, kind of making it simple, especially if you're going to be pulsing them on a frequent basis, making it simple because they're not going to participate in every single one. I was actually most recently I was the vice president of sales for a technology company, and one of the suggestions I had, based on some technology that we already had, was every time an employee logs in, to ask them a pulse question and maybe ask one a month, right? And every time they log into the HR system, you're asking the same one through the month of December or whatever, right?
Sure.
And then you get that feedback. And once they've answered it, don't ask it again, right? Just it's not there. There's no need to ask it again. But some people only log into their systems once a month, and some people honestly only ever do it like once a quarter or something like that. But at least you're getting some form of feedback there, and that's more of a kind of passive way to do it that we were trying to figure it out. But for you, you're being more proactive. Professionally persistent and annoying.
Yeah, professionally persistent. Professionally persistent sounds a little bit better. The one thing I will say about that is make sure you follow up on it, right? So one of the worst things I can see with pulse surveys and everything else is we're asking a lot of questions, zero follow through.
Yeah, what are you doing?
Someone is like, man, this is going really bad, or I feel like this manager isn't helping me, and nothing ever happens. Kind of a waste of data collection, right? Because it doesn't translate into action. So there needs to sort of be that two-part of why are you collecting, and then what are you doing with it, and then actually do something with it.
So that's feedback from the employees. But what about output metrics, the volume of work completed? That, for sales, that could be the number of presentations. For customer service, it could be the number of tickets or other things. How important are those to track, and how do you measure that with some of the other important ones like employee wellness, work-life balance, and things like that?
Yeah, so to me, there's usually three metrics or three pillars of metrics I like to sort of compare and contrast. And so one would be if your company has core values, and if they don't, they really should, right? You should have those principles on which you stand. And I'm a big proponent of EOS, or not EOS necessarily, but that kind of system where your employees have a score assigned relative to those core values, and you're kind of keeping track with that, right? Because that's right person, right seat type of stuff. Then there is just the core competencies of a role. Right. And then there are those 3 to 5 measurable metrics, right? So if you're a help desk employee, there's how many tickets do you resolve? Do you have, what is the customer satisfaction score for those tickets that have been resolved? And then, potentially 2 or 3 more that might be dependent to your organization, but not only choosing one of those pillars, right? Because your employee is more than just their output, right? And so from a leadership down perspective, it's understanding what you expect out of employees and managers, whether it's on a weekly cadence or a monthly cadence or a quarterly cadence or a yearly cadence, and then communicating that, right? Because the worst thing you can do is to have different expectations on paper than you do behind closed doors, to say, this is what I expect out of you, and then an employee meets it, and you're like, well, that's not good enough because I thought you were going to do better. It's like, okay, well, that's not great, right? Because then that's making it about you, and it's putting more distance between yourself and the employee, and honestly, yourself and the goal, right? Because an employee that feels like they've worked up to a point that you asked of them, and you're saying, well, you didn't because I wanted you really to go farther, you need to be kind of clear about that, right? So setting those right expectations when building out what a role is really, really, really important, right? But I like to make sure that, there's employee wellness, which is sort of folded into those core values and kind of their CSAT, their SAT scores, those core competencies, and then some actual productivity metrics. Sorry, I cleared my throat there. Some productivity metrics that are in line with what's expected of the role, right? So if it's closing 80% of your tickets on a monthly basis and you close 80, then you've met it. But it's also useful to create an infrastructure or scaffolding for, well, if you exceed it, this is what exceeding it means, right? So really identifying and defining what matters is so vitally important from a leadership perspective, because if you don't have that, how do you know if an employee is doing well, and then how does an employee know if they're doing well?
Yeah. I'm curious, what do you feel, because I've heard it a million different ways, but what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. And I do believe that to a certain extent, but what do you feel like, how do you feel about like stack ranking? I've seen so many organizations say, hey, like red, yellow, green, this is what good looks like. This is what not so good looks like. And then, there's a lot of people in the middle. But like, how do you feel about that? Do you think that is something from a cultural standpoint that should stick around? I mean, it's been around a long time, but, and then do you think it's productive, or a productive way to do it? Because, if somebody's green, they probably feel pretty good about themselves, right? But what about this person that's red? At the other end, are they red for, specific reasons? Do they have a bad territory? Do they have, are there other indicators? How do you guys use any sort of systems like that? And how do you feel about them?
So, as a generality, I like the idea of it, right? Because it's something you can look at, right? It visually, it's like, oh, an employee can look like, oh, I'm doing good. The downside is how it's being measured is not easily understandable to an employee. So if they're red, let's say, are they like red about to be yellow, or are they like bottom red, right? And so if there is a distinction between those two, red doesn't cover it, right? If you're yellow, are you yellow about to go green, or are you yellow about to go red, right? Or are you just like firmly in the middle? Because if indeed stacked ranking like that is how you determine whether or not somebody is close to getting a performance bonus or potentially having to go to a remediation plan or be terminated, the employee doesn't really understand what they need to do differently, right? So if you're going to use something like stacked ranking, then there needs to be a conversation that goes along with it, right? There needs to be an indicator of, you're red, this is what red means for you, this is how you go to yellow, or this is what happens if you don't go to yellow, right? So I'm sort of singing the same songs here, but really identifying and defining what those metrics matter, right? Both for as a leader, because you don't ever want to be perceived as someone who's constantly changing their mind or generating manufactured urgency. And sometimes the way you present data or the way you present expectations can create that without meaning to. Like, even if it wasn't your intention to do so, you're creating a lot of ambiguity in how well an employee is doing or how well the company is doing, right? So I do like it. I sort of, again, prefer to use what people want. So I start with, well, how would you... I go to employees, let's say I'm going to a new company, whether it's consulting or I was working for a company, and say, how do you currently assess employees? What does it look like? And then I go to employees and say, how would you like to be assessed? What parts of your role would you like to know how well you're doing on, and how would you like to get that information? And then sort of finding a middle ground. I find more often than not, Likert scales or ranked scales work if there is a meaningful difference between the indicators, whether it's a color or a number or a happy face and a neutral face and a sad face, if we're using like the hospital thing, like where's your pain level at, type of thing. But it's usually more than three, right? There's sort of like there's a directionality to it, and you can see how one would go from one to the other. So I do like it from the simple fact that I do think employees should be able to assess very quickly how well they're doing, and leaders and managers need to be able to provide that assessment quickly. If any part of that relationship takes too long, bad things creep in. So we want to make sure that it's simple and it's clear as possible.
So kind of taking this full circle, how would one balance individual kind of contributor numbers or figures like what we've been talking about, and the need for flexibility and autonomy to make sure that organizational goals, are being met at the same time within, time-based projects and deliverables. So like, how do you balance those things, and what are some strategies that you leverage today?
Yeah, so I would say making sure you're realistic about the process, right? So, that leaders are having honest conversations with themselves and other leaders about what they actually expect, and that those expectations are reasonable, and that is synced up with what the employee knows is reasonable, right? So if an employee knows they need to complete X, and that X leads to outcome Y, it is not a hard sell to say, hey, we need you to go to X. And so making sure that you have that equanimity across the board about what actually matters to each person is really, really important. But beyond that, it's setting realistic goals and having conversations and communicating, right? Because more often than not, I'll see people have, really dynamic business objectives that are not communicated well, and then really poor objectives that are communicated well, that are not like we're going to grow by 400% year over year, and it's like, well,
right.
How? Like how are we accomplishing
happen, yeah.
that? And it's like, well, the productivity, everybody has to work 130% more than, well, that's like, nobody wants to do that. Like, why don't we hire a little more into it or something like that? So to me, it always starts with the conversation. And then to bring it really, really full circle back to the story, right, is what kind of story are you telling? And are you telling it often? And are you telling the same story? And are you willing to admit when the story changes? So if there's nothing wrong with changing your mind, that's growth. There's nothing wrong with having your ideas challenged and coming to a new conclusion. That's growth. Right, but if you can't admit when you're wrong, or you can't admit that something's changed, you're never going to hit your goals, right? Because things are always changing for everybody else all of the time.
I think it's powerful to kind of bring it full circle, like you said, because just the part there where you've just got to be willing to admit that you don't kind of know everything, and then willing to get your ego out of the way is so powerful, because then growth can happen. Right, mm-hmm. Because we're all ego-driven people to certain levels, right?
Sure.
And that causes us to behave certain ways and to think certain ways and to internalize things in our own way. But I think if we can remove the ego, like you said, it gives us an opportunity to grow together. And I will tell you, I've had some really bad employees that I've learned a lot from. And they were probably only bad in those situations because maybe it wasn't a good fit from the very beginning, or something had changed, or the story was fiction, and they got off on this other path where they felt it was one thing or another, and for numerous different reasons. But so let me ask this around kind of leading high performance teams, right? And I think everybody wants to have a high performance team. To a certain extent, what has been your experience at the company you're at in helping you shape kind of the views of the organization to kind of foster and create that culture of high performance? And what other mechanisms have you used, maybe even outside of what we've discussed today, to help you do that?
So you kind of touched on one of them right there when you were sort of describing your own experience, which was, is the person on your team the right person on your team? Like there's
Sure.
nothing. It might not even be that they're a bad employee. Maybe they're just a bad fit, right? So
Right.
really, going through that due diligence of did I hire this person, or am I keeping this person for the right reasons? Like if I have a high performing sales team, but I have someone on that team who's a high performer, but he's a toxic culture person, or she makes it, she doesn't want to work with other people, let's say, or whatever it is, right? Really assessing whether or not that's the right person is sort of. It's really step one, right? Because without that, you can do all of the incentives in the world. You can have a million offsites. You can build out performance reviews that are perfect and best in class, but that's still the wrong person on your team. And it's not unlike sports, right? I think about it with like football. Someone who can throw a deep ball doesn't matter if you don't have a great receiver.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. They can't catch her. No one's a great slot receiver. No one's great. It doesn't actually matter, right? So making sure the personnel is what you need is step one. Step two is all of that personnel understands their role and what's expected of them, and those expectations are communicated clearly and frequently. And when stuff changes, good or bad, right? Good, bad, or indifferent, that communication is given to them, and it's moved on, and it's done so in a timely manner. And then you really understand what people need and want, right? So everybody has a number that will make their life easy to live, so they won't have to worry about money. And it's not the same number for everybody, because the economy is different in different cities and different parts of the country. But the reality is, it doesn't matter what you think someone should get paid. They have a number that's going to keep them from being worried. Not that you have to pay that number, but knowing that number will help you understand whether or not that person's someone for your team. You could have someone who's a great performer, but they live in, San Francisco, and you can only afford to pay X base, and that just, there's no harm. It doesn't work for them because they can't afford to live where they live to do that. And pretending that that's not real, or trying to convince them to take less because of OT somewhere in the back end, that's a risk worth taking, but I can almost guarantee that you're going to be fighting that battle the entire time they're an employee until that minimum gets up to what their living standard is. And so if I were to sum it up, right, it's right people, make sure you got the right personnel, make sure they understand what they're supposed to do, and those communications are translated clearly and often, and then really understand the needs of that team and make sure you're providing what they need. And it's not always salary, but sometimes it is.
Yeah, there's so many sports analogies I could go with. I know you're, I know you're a Patriots fan. I mean, the big question for a long time was, could Belichick or Brady do it alone, right? And let's make the argument that, they probably could, but having the right personnel, right coaching, right players on the field, like right support staff, these are all imperative to at least sustained success, right? Like everybody can have good games. Everybody can have, even potentially a breakout season, but like to pull it all together and have consistency year over year, you need all of those things. And I think you're making that same argument. Yeah, absolutely.
Yep, exactly.
So, what are potentially some pros and cons of being in the tech industry? Because tech is unique. They're kind of a unicorn when it comes to industries, and so I think the mindset is already like we can do a little bit more from a work-life balance standpoint, from an incentive standpoint, and things like that. So, how do you kind of look at that compared to other industries you've worked in and around, and the tech industry specifically?
There's sort of an interesting comparison there, right? Because I would argue that traditional organizations and organizations, let's say pre-tech, moved slower with stuff, but maybe they cared a little bit less about employees. And a lot of modern tech companies care about employees, or at least that's their story, but they want to move too fast. They want to adopt something or change something or add something new, and they want everybody to get on board tomorrow and let's just go. Right. And that there's a weird shuffle. And again, I think that's that transition from traditional to remote is we need that same slow, maybe not slow is probably the wrong word, but an iterative approach to change with employee welfare centered in that. Right. Yep. And to me, that's the pro and con. So the pro of tech is they really do care, and they know that they need to, right? Because stuff's changing. If you want to get the best folks, they're getting younger and younger, and they want different things. And so you need to keep up with that. But they want to change the world tomorrow, and they want stuff to change tomorrow. And that often works to the detriment of culture, because then your culture becomes scattershot and chaos. And controlled chaos is fun in a startup. It is not fun when you're at 50, 100, 200 employees. Controlled chaos is a nightmare for employees, right? Because they just don't know where to – if you don't know where to go to with the problem, or you don't know how to fix a problem, that's scary, right? And the opposite was you knew where to go in HR because it was that one room on the third floor that was kind of dark and the lighting didn't really work, and it was stacks of papers and there was file cabinets everywhere. You knew that was the room you had to go to, and you knew you had to fill out a piece of paper and it could take 2 weeks to get back. But you knew where it was. There was a clear structure to it. And if something had to change, there was a process. A lot of times that explosive, disruptive nature of tech is like, we'll figure out the process. I always credit to the metaphor I use is they want to build the car while they're driving it. So we'll figure out the process at the end of it. Like we'll drive this car as we're going, and we'll figure out how to build the car when we get to the end. The car's built. And it's like that's awesome, but scary for employees.
Yeah, it doesn't have seatbelts, It
doesn't have a windshield. It's got 4 tires, but maybe one of them isn't, quite right. Yeah.
Yeah, sounds about right. Well, thank you for your perspective on those. I do have one last question I always like to ask, and so what would be your advice? A piece of advice that you would offer up to your younger self? Either trying to be where you're at today, or to maybe look at things from a fresh perspective, kind of moving forward.
Take more business risks.
Really?
I was very slow in the beginning. I was a little nervous about what would happen next, and I sort of wish that some of the ideas I had. And when I say take risks, I mean I was always worried I got to set up an LLC and I got to build this and I build that. Just try to sell one. If I could go back in time and just pick something you love of all those ideas and just sell one. And then once you sell one, be like, oh, I can do this, and this is what it looks like. and then take the moment to stop and go, okay, well, this is what I want this to look like, versus spending too much time thinking about it and maybe being too slow to adopt because I didn't have the time to do it. So I would have taken more risk in the sense that I would have tried to just sell it once. I'd be like, okay, I'm gonna give this a shot. Like, I love doing X. I think this could be something I need to go out and give a shot. And I didn't. And if I go back in time, I would do that for sure.
That's good advice for somebody who is not like risk adverse that is risk adverse. I would say that I'm the exact opposite. I probably need to take less risks. Just because I'm a go fast kind of guy. And some people aren't ready for that. I'm build the plane in the air guy.
We're going down, right? I mean, we're flying. We're falling until we're flying, right? Like, it's just controlled falling until we're flying. I get that. Well.
Yeah. But look, we need people on both ends of the spectrum because, as you were pointing out before, you've got to have, people who are throttling back while others are flying high. You can only have so many high flyers within an organization because otherwise stuff doesn't actually get done. And when you do, you break too many things, right? So I think it's a great point for somebody who is naturally more kind of reserved in the way that they approach things to maybe take a few extra risks because there is a happy balance.
Yeah, no, and I agree, right? So when I say take risk, I suppose I don't mean vacillate all the way to taking all the risks. A more controlled approach, because I am a little bit, I was a little bit risk adverse when I was younger, and a little bit kind of like, can I do that? Should I do that?
Yeah.
And that definitely dragged my feet a few times.
Well, that's okay. You've landed in a good spot. You're doing well for yourself.
Yeah, I feel like I'm doing all right now, yeah.
Yeah, good. Well, I want to thank you for coming on the show with me. I always like to ask before we kind of bring things full circle, where can people find you if they'd like to connect with, chat with, follow, or read, some of your work? Because I know you got quite a bit out there.
Sure. Obviously, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty visible there. I have a website, author Dan O'Brien. So O'Brien, Obrien. I think I still have a Twitter account. I probably do. I don't know. Is Twitter still there? I don't know. But on almost all socials and stuff, I'm always author Dan O'Brien. So at author Dan O'Brien. So if you just search on one of those, if I'm there, you'll find me. I'd say the website or LinkedIn is probably the easiest way to sort of reach out.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on the show today. I want to say thank you to the listeners. I hope you'll boop the like button if you like the video. Make sure you subscribe to hear future. Again, the podcast, What the Tech, actually comes out and airs every Tuesday at noon. So I want to say thank you again for tuning in. And thanks again, my man, Dan, for getting on here and sharing some wisdom.
Appreciate you having me, man. It was awesome.
Awesome. Take care.
Bye-bye.